StoryHinge, Episode 82, Jonathan Schwabish, Data and Storytelling.
You know, all the way back to what we started with, I think storytelling is going to be a bigger and bigger thing. I think trying to combine quantitative data and qualitative data is what is going to help people connect with content, because when you can show a video of an interview with someone who's being affected by some policy, and then you can combine that with survey data that sort of broadens it, that gives you this bigger perspective, you get people to both connect with the content on sort of a personal level, and then they understand the bigger story.
Welcome to StoryHinge. At StoryHinge, we explore foundational ideas and beliefs. We believe everyone has a beautiful story to grow. Now here's your host, Jason Vidaurri.
Welcome. Hope you're having a great day out there. Today we are going to be speaking with Jonathan Schwabish. Now he's the founder of a data visualization and presentation skills firm called PolicyViz. He's also a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, a nonprofit research institution in Washington, D.C. Dr. Schwabish is also considered a leader in data visualization field and is a leading voice for clarity and accessibility in research. He's also the host of a podcast called PolicyViz Podcast. I think the interest here is if you're dealing with data and not telling story with that, I think you're missing an opportunity to communicate. And Jonathan's going to take us to that and help us understand that better. And also, if you're telling story, there's maybe an opportunity to bring in data in that and make it a more powerful story. So with that, Jonathan Schwabish, welcome to StoryHinge.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, real excited to talk to you, Jonathan. Before we started talking here, I mentioned that I have my career for almost 20 years now is in chemical engineering. So I've dealt with a lot of data, and I know you do too, and you have some things to say about that and how to present that better. But here at StoryHinge, we like to go back in time a little bit and hear some of your foundation, what led you up to where you're at today.
Sure. Yeah, so like you, I have a different kind of background than what we're talking about today. My background is actually in economics. I spent nearly a decade at the Congressional Budget Office here in D.C. CBO is the budget arm of the U.S. Congress. So when I was there, I primarily worked on Social Security reform for the first 5 or 6 years when I was there. I helped work on the model that did the Social Security estimates for Congress, and then I worked on a variety of other things like comprehensive immigration reform, and I did a lot of work on food stamps and disability insurance. And around 2012 or so, right when there was a big discussion about the deficit, and there was this big fiscal cliff debate about what would happen if the tax rates went back up, the economy would fall apart. What was happening is that we were publishing a lot of reports responding to requests from Congress, and it didn't seem to me that we were getting the attention that I thought the reports deserved. And I started thinking a little bit harder about how we were presenting the work, and it was in your standard 100-page reports, and the graphs were really not that engaging. They were, we're researchers, and so we kind of have this perspective on we're going to present data in a graph and everyone should sort of get it, and that really wasn't happening. So I got interested. Yeah.
I was just I can relate to that because as an engineer, you're dealing with a lot of data, making graphs, and sometimes you're presenting to your bosses and lots of times they're engineers too, but we always had to feel like we had to simplify down so they could understand it. We used to joke that if you're presenting to an executive or something, a pie chart is as complicated as you want to get.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because you as researchers or as people working with data, you're familiar with your work, and a lot of times we sort of forget that the person we're showing it to has either never seen it before, they may not have even been familiar with the topic. But yeah, even when you're talking to your boss or your manager, they may be seeing the graph for the way you're presenting it may be totally different. So it's in a lot of ways it's about empathy. In some ways it's about putting yourself in someone else's shoes to say, okay, so what would my reader or audience member or user of the website, how are they going to perceive something that they've never seen before? And we weren't really doing that. The research community sort of writ large really still not doing that. So I got engaged with the data visualization community. I didn't really realize that there was a whole group of people who were thinking very hard about how to do a better job of communicating and visualizing data. And once I discovered that community, I started working a little bit harder to try to change the way I, as an individual researcher, and we as an agency, communicated our work. So when I was there, towards the beginning part of the 2010s, we started improving our graphs and our standard reports. We were making new report types. We were making new graph types. And then a few years ago, I decided to move on from CBO. So I moved over to the Urban Institute, which is a nonprofit research institution here in DC, where we have about 10 different centers working on a variety of different areas, from justice policy to health policy to housing, and our goal is to really elevate the debate around those issues. And for me personally, I spend half my time still doing research, but the other half of my time is in the communications department, where I'm helping people create data visualizations. I'm teaching people about data visualizations, and same things with presentations, where I'm helping people build slides and again helping them communicate their data as they hopefully start to think about their audience or their reader, and how's that person or those people, how are they going to perceive the information. And so to sort of tie it back to what I think we're going to talk about today, what you hear a lot in the data visualization community, or people who work with data in general, is like, we're going to tell a story with data. Here's a story I'm going to tell. And I sort of have a kind of a nuanced view on that, that oftentimes we're actually not telling a story. We're just making a point or an argument, and it's not really the traditional view of story. And so that's what intrigues me about your show. This traditional definition of what is story. How do we define and think about story? And for me, how do we apply that to working with data?
Okay, very good. So why don't we jump into that and talk a little bit here, story, since you brought that up. Because the word story has been, especially I think now, has been used pretty widely. It doesn't even mean story anymore. It just means,
right,
I'm just going to tell you something. Okay, that's a story. Well, maybe not.
maybe not. Yeah.
So when you hear that, I guess in the work you do, what does it mean to you, the word story?
Yeah, so I think you're right. Like, people just throw this word story around, and I guess maybe at the end of this conversation we'll be like, well, does it really matter? Because if I say I'm going to tell you a story, I kind of know what you mean. But I also think that if we use that word more carefully, and we use it with what I would say its intended definition, then we will be more conscious and more purposeful about, in my case, how we actually do tell stories with data. So let's just sort of back up for a second and say, when someone shows you, let's just say, a line graph, and they say, this graph is showing you, I'm telling you a story about how the unemployment rate went up between this year and anher year, right? Mm-hmm. And they give you this graph. That's not really a story. That's just a point. That's an argument. That's not a story. For me, there's lots of definitions of story, right? So Aristotle, if we go all the way back, Aristotle was, a story has a beginning, a middle, and the end. Mm-hmm. And what I like to say about that is that's kind of not satisfactory. Like, my breakfast had a beginning, a middle, and the end. So that's not really a story, right? So, and there's lots of research and writing about this. For me, story kind of needs two things. It needs emotion. It needs emotion that's crucial to the story. It's something that makes you feel, something that causes you to remember the story, maybe even act on the lessons of the story. And that emotion really is visceral in some sense, right? Like, if I showed you a line chart of a stock price of a company that you invested in, and it went down, you might feel bad about that, but like, maybe not deeply, right? I mean, mm-hmm. Maybe not like in your pit of your soul. So a story really makes you feel in that sort of deep, visceral way. So that's the first part. And then the second part for me is that it has a meaningful climax. Like, the story takes you towards a climax and then resolves. And there's lots of different structures for how we get to the climax, and sort of once the story hits the climax, how do we sort of come down the other side of the mountain, as it were. But when people do this with data, it's not really a story in those ways. It's a line chart, it's a bar chart, it's a pie chart. And that's not really, even if I care about the topic, even if I deeply care about the topic, having that number or statistic or trend in front of me doesn't really make me feel, it's not really driving to that meaningful climax. So for me, when I'm thinking about stories and data, I'm really thinking about pieces where I'm bringing in narrative pieces that combine the story with visuals, with graphs, and oftentimes I am trying to think about an individual and bring in an individual's experience that really is the hook, the emotional or the narrative hook, as opposed to just saying, here's a bunch of numbers and therefore it's a story.
Yeah, I like that. I like that, attaching the personal individual to it.
Yeah, because we all see, and many of us work with data all the time, but we all see data all the time. And even if it's something I care about, it's not personal to me unless I can see how it impacts me or my family or my friends or my colleagues, right? Like I think another good example of this is, when we talk about big numbers, like when I worked with budget numbers, it's like, okay, so I don't know what, no one really knows what $600 billion means. Like, it's just this huge number, right? It's like you try to make that personal for people. There's always you always see these numbers about, if we were to reduce the deficit, every family would have to pay, I don't know what it is, but, it has to pay $15,000. Okay. So let's just say it's $15,000 and that's going to sum to, $5 trillion. I don't know what $5 trillion is, but I know what $15,000 means. Like, I can sort of get my head around that. And so it's making it more personal. So I really like this idea of trying to tie data to the individual or to the small group, where you say, okay, what's your experience in the labor market? What's your experience with, at your kid's school that's, losing funding or whatever. So I think that the individual is how we connect with the content, and that's really where I think we get to tell the story.
Yeah, no, I really like that. I guess as I'm thinking about an application in my own career and life, as I'm thinking about some of the things I'll have to present. You're already hitting on some of this, but are there some basic things to consider in presenting that data that you say, hey, consider this before you start diving into how you're going to present it?
Yeah, so I think there's like lots of answers to that too, right? Because how we present data, if you're going to put it in a report, like a journal article, that's one thing. If you're going to put it on a website or a blog post, that's another thing, where maybe it's interactive. If you're going to present it on a screen, that's even yet another way. So I think for most of us, it's probably like the standard, put a graph in a document or a report, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is a hard one for a lot of people. I mean, I'll tell you, it's hard for me. Like, when I'm doing a report on food stamps, for example, I do a lot of research on food stamps. I'll make a graph of the participation rate or something, right? How do I make that relevant? How do I find individual stories behind that? Because there are stories about, a family who, lost their jobs in a recession. They had to go on food stamps. Maybe it was just for some period of time. There's lots of stories of people who are, for example, receiving food stamps. And those are the things that make us care, make us connect. Let me tell you a story about how I think this actually works for people. So I have a colleague at Urban Institute, and she does a lot of work on the welfare system and how families interact with the welfare system. And so she did she was working on a report, and she had to give a presentation I think it was at a conference or something, and she did a practice run at work, and she invited a bunch of people to come watch her give this practice run. And basically what the research, basically, they went to Denver and some other areas in Colorado, and they interviewed a whole bunch of a whole number of different families to get what their experience was with the welfare system in Colorado. So, what did it take to apply and maintain your benefits and all these sort of things. So I go sit down to the presentation, and it's your sort of standard academic presentation, right? There's the introduction, there's the previous literature, here's the data, here's the methods, and here's the conclusion, right? So I've sort of like, in my head, that to me always looks like a pyramid where like branches out, like it's very detailed, and then at the very end you get the conclusion, like what's the point of the story, or the point of the paper, which is sort of different from how we might define story, where the climax is not the last thing that happens. It happens, towards the end, but you have a resolution.
Yeah.
So it was a fine presentation. It didn't really make me feel, it didn't really make me care all that much. So afterwards, I'm sitting there talking to her and the rest of her research team, and they start talking about some of the interviews that they had conducted. They had talked to a single mom with 2 kids, and how she had to take one kid to the elementary school, the other kid was younger, had to go to daycare, and then to go reapply for her benefits, she had to take the day off from work. She had to take 3 buses to get to downtown Denver, stand in this long line, and they're telling us these different stories. And my response was, that should be your presentation. Like, I don't really, the numbers that you show, they're valuable and they help put things in context. But the stories are the things that make me care about these numbers, right? That you tell me that so many families in Colorado or in whatever state are, they're below the poverty line, or they're on these benefits. I can intellectually appreciate that maybe that's a large number, but if you tell me these stories of families and their struggles, that has meaning to me, because that's the human challenge, and that's where I think we, in the field of sort of doing research, that's where I think we can really connect with people, with our readers and our audiences, is to really think about the stories that we can tell. And that's what I think connects with people.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's really an important part, and it's often missed.
Yeah, the other thing, it's funny because a lot of people tell me, well, I don't have a good story. I downloaded this big data set and I ran these regressions, and here's the numbers. And sometimes the story isn't so much about the content per se, but it's about the researcher's story. Like, is there a story you can tell about the struggle you had with collecting the data or downloading the data, or like, why did you get interested in this topic in the first place? I did a paper a few years ago on how people apply for food stamp benefits through websites. And when I was presenting that paper, I actually just start the whole presentation with a story. That the reason I was interested in this topic, or the reason I started doing the research, was I was at the time taking my daughter to school, and we would take the city bus. This is in DC. We take it down to H Street and 7th in Northeast DC, and we get off the city bus, and that was where the food stamp office was. And as we'd walk down the block, there was a long line of people waiting for the office to open, and they would all be on their cell phones. And, I started thinking about, okay, so how does government and technology, how are these things interacting with one another? And so those, the stories don't have to be this, sort of epic tale of the Odyssey or the Iliad or something like that, right? It can be, what was my experience as a researcher? How did I get interested? How did I, what were the challenges that I have? And those things make it personal, so that people can relate better, I think, to the content.
That's a good point. Yeah. Like I said, I have dealt with a lot of data through my years, and earlier in my career, I remember you reminded me of, as you're sharing some of this, me and one of my colleagues, another engineer, we had to process a lot of data during this in this job. And how do you find that line where because I guess someone who's dealt with a lot of data, you can I won't say manipulate it, but you can present the data and emphasize certain parts of it, de-emphasize other parts of it, and almost move it towards the story that you want to tell, if you want to use the data that way. How do you?
No, absolutely.
How do you? I guess ethically present that in the right way, or know where those boundaries might be.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's sort of a key question in some ways to visualizing data. I mean, we could take a simple one. So if I told you that 60% of people in this survey said yes to some question, I could also say that 40% said no. Both of those things are true.
Yeah.
But one one might have a different tone than, the people who say yes is sort of more positive maybe, and the ones that say no is sort of more negative. And so they can both be true, but they can have different connotations. I'd say specifically to sort of visualizing data, there's actually, there's really not many hard rules to data visualization. I think the only rule, I think this is right. I think the only rule that the field sort of agrees on is that when you make a bar or a column chart, it has to start at 0. And the reason being that when you start a chart like that at something other than 0, you overemphasize the difference between the two, let's say the two bars.
Yeah.
And there are lots of other ways to distort data. There's if you look at the presidential election, the last election, President Trump likes to show this map of, the map is very red.
Yeah.
As an example, right? So there's a lot of he shows county level votes and it's a lot of red. Well, that's not showing votes, that's showing land area, which is very different.
Yeah.
And at the same token, there's lots of people on the other side of the aisle who show maps that instead of using coloring in the counties, they show circles or bubbles around areas, and when you do it that way, you see sort of more, let's just say, blue circles. But that's also kind of misleading because really what matters for the presidential election is electoral votes, right? It's not that it doesn't really matter if you get all the votes in California or if you get 51%. It's just the majority, because it's electoral college. It just matters. That's just what matters. So there's lots of ways to distort data or the visualization of that data, I should say. But I think your question is really at the core of stepping even further back of, people who are manipulating the underlying data to present something that, is not honest, it's not objective. And that's really hard. I mean, that's sometimes like you don't even know, because they may be compiling a large data set and they're doing some coding to it. And, maybe they're not even doing it maliciously. They just, they made a mistake, right? So I have a belief that we can raise the literacy around graphics and around numeracy by exposing people to different kinds of graphs, by explaining how the graphs work, and the same thing with statistics and numbers, if we're careful and try to explain those. Now, that's a really hard thing to do. I don't think a lot of people are like, ooh, let me learn more about percentiles and about a normal distribution versus a Poisson distribution. It's not something that people are really, the everyday person's interested in. But, maybe it's the case that through explaining how a graph works, we get to explain how data works. And, I think it's becoming truer and truer that to be successful in today's world, where we have more technology, we have more media, we have more graphs, we have more content flowing at us, that being able to understand data and understand statistics and numbers is becoming more and more important.
Yeah, I agree. I remember taking my statistics class, and basically looking at data and what things mean. And I remember one of the conversations during that class was that there aren't a lot of standards out there that say, here's how you do this, work this data, and how you don't work it.
Yeah,
and it's kind of align what you're talking about. Do you see any movements towards maybe more standardized approaches on these things, so that when we do look at data, we know that it was I guess processed in a certain manner?
Yes and no. So there's a big open source community that has been growing over the last few years, and an open data community, so that data is more open, and that way we require it's easier to check. There's an open source community, which means that code becomes more open, so again it's easier to check. In the academic area, it's more and more journals require you to post your data and to post your code. So again, it's easier to replicate and check. But there's, all of this requires someone to do something, to say, well, I'm going to investigate this a little bit more. And I'm not sure that people are going to do that. Now, there are cases where it's easy to do that, where someone posts a graph and you say, man, I'm not sure, before I'm going to retweet this or share this, I'm going to take a look at the source data real quick. I'm just going to look at the original report that this draws from and see if they're misrepresenting it. So I think part of it requires all of us to take, every once in a while, take an extra second with a graph before sharing it or promoting it or even, using it to say, let me just make sure that this is showing what the author says it's showing. There's a University of Miami journalism professor, Alberto Cairo, is a guy who's written at length in the field of data visualization, and he's been doing a tour basically around the world talking about how charts lie, and he's working on a book as well. And I think this is one of the messages in his talk, is that it really is a responsibility of all of us to essentially be our own fact checkers. That when we see something that we need to, maybe take a pause for a moment before we share it, before we promote it, and just say, is this thing showing the right information? And, the challenge, of course, is, to be able to do that, we need to know something about graphics and about data. So if I've never, ever worked with data before, it's not something that just comes naturally. I need to, there is a learning curve to understanding it. So I think it's a high bar to sort of do these fact checks and to understand how people may be misusing data, but it's something that can be learned. And I think there's more and more resources and books and speakers and websites out there that are dedicated to trying to help people understand how to work with and use and visualize data.
No, that's good. I know one of the topics and trends that maybe coming at us because of technology is more data, just massive amounts of data and being able to analyze it. And I think that's going to be key for us going forward to be able to make sure we're understanding this data in the correct way. So
yeah, it's interesting too. I actually wonder if the big data, the more data, whether it actually makes the storytelling part easier. So is it if I look at Twitter data or Google search data, in some ways some of that data is easier to relate to, and I wonder if it becomes a little bit easier to tell stories. I'm in the middle. I'm gonna reach down here. I'm reading a book right now. I think I'm a little bit behind. I think this is from last year. I'm reading this book, Everybody Lies, Big Data, New Data, and What the Internet Can Tell Us About Who We Really Are by Seth Stevens Davidowitz. And so he's an economist, and he essentially uses Google search data. So he explores Google search data to see, how people really behave. I think his argument is essentially that, our Google searches are really what we think and what we do. He finds, much bigger sort of proportions of people who are searching for racist terms, and people who are, looking for, maybe sexual behaviors that they might not say in a sort of standard survey. And every little piece of the book where he talks about the research he did on people searching, on people doing racist searches around, president's speeches, for example, I feel like I can connect to that. I feel like I can understand that because we all do Google searches and we all know what it means to search for ourselves, or maybe we would search for something that we would never, we wouldn't say to someone else, just even a medical question we might put into our computer, but we wouldn't ask someone. So I wonder whether big data, more data from sort of non-traditional sources is going to lead to maybe better storytelling. I don't know. That's like a total hypothesis, and maybe it's a bit of a highfalutin, hope. But I don't know.
It's interesting though. It's interesting to see where that goes, because I can see it working that way, definitely. As you've gone into this and this visualization and getting better in presenting data, I guess maybe a story or two where you really help someone create something that originally was not as compelling, and then through this, through your work, you're able to really change that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I have a few of those. One definitely comes to mind quickly. So there is a conference, a public policy conference that takes place every fall. And the president of the organization gets to do a speech, And usually the speech is about some research that he or she is doing or has done, and about the organization itself. And I was contacted by the president of this particular organization. This would have been like a year and a half ago, and she said, I have to give this talk, and I have your book, and I really want to try to improve the way I present it, but I'm having some difficulty. So she sent me the slide deck, and we chatted over email, and then it turned out that I was in town where she worked, and we had lunch together and chatted about it. And she was doing some really interesting work where she had collected, she and her team had collected data on people coming over the Mexican border, not necessarily unauthorized, people living sort of along the Texas border along Mexico. And basically especially in Texas, if you have a Mexican ID card called the matricular card, that's essentially a valid identification in Texas. Now I'm summarizing the content here, and I don't quite have all the details, but so forgive me if she's listening and I'm getting this wrong. But basically what happened in Texas was that the Department of Health in Texas basically at one point ruled that card was no longer valid identification. And so a lot of people were being denied benefits or not being arrested, but denied benefits and other things that they were previously entitled to. So she had this really interesting data. They had done interviews, and the slides that she sent me were sort of standard academic style with lots of bullet points and graphs with the labels that were really small, and they're basically screenshots out of a PDF. And so, I sort of dove in and tore that apart and started rebuilding it. And one of the things that I like to do in my slides is I like to use a lot of pictures, because not only are we more likely to remember and recognize content when it's shown to us visually, when we use good imagery, it's like a visual anchor. It sits in our brain and it's something that we remember. And so I started peppering her presentation with, some of it was just landscape pictures of Texas, but it was taking what was like black text on a white background and putting it like white text on a darker background with a picture of Texas behind it and reducing the amount of text. And so that's like a visual anchor. And the one picture that I found I often use this website. Unsplash is a website I use for photos, because the photos are really high quality and they're free, and and it's a great tool. So I went in there and I did a bunch of searches, and I found this picture of a young Mexican girl on this green. The background was sort of green. It was like she was standing against a green wall. And it was just a great picture, and because it had all this great green space for a good, 2/3 of the picture. It was perfect for a slide, because you could put it up there and you could put text off to the left. And so we used this picture right at the end of her presentation. And it was like the last 3 slides was this picture. And then as you click through, she had like the 3 big conclusions from the research. So it's like point 1 was, ABC, DEF, XYZ, and the last slide. And so this picture of this young girl was on this big screen in this big auditorium for whatever it was, 5-10 minutes. And after the talk, people were talking about that picture and how it really meant something to them, or it really hit home. It really emphasized the content. So it was really taking some content that was your standard sort of academic prose and really trying to make it simpler, but using imagery, and also encouraging her, the researcher, to share stories about the people that they had talked to. So to not just boil it down to the numbers, but to actually tell the story of the mother in Texas who had a baby and couldn't take the baby home with her because all she had was this matricular ID card. So those sort of stories really worked for that presentation.
No, that's good. That's good.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where you can. I mean, I think probably a lot of people who are listening to this have sat in presentations before, and either a small room or a big room, and you can sort of feel it sometimes. People, you can look around, people are looking at their phones or they're dozing off, and I'm in this room and I'm looking around. And you could really see everyone paying attention, and especially in the economics field, that's pretty rare that people are still paying attention an hour in. But you could feel the room, which was really great. Let me try to think of another one. So another one that's not slides, but of data visualization, is another colleague at Urban, was doing a paper on tax reform, and she came down and she had this stack of graphs, and just trying to playing around with the way to visualize the data. But for a lot of people, their library of graphs, their toolbox, is essentially what's in the Excel drop-down menu, right? It's like columns, bars, areas, and pies. It's like this is sort of a limited set. And so part of again, back to that graphic literacy, I believe people can learn lots of different graph types. They may not be inherently better than the line chart, but sometimes different is good, and sometimes different is actually better. But people just haven't been exposed to the graph types. And so this researcher came down, and she wanted some help, and we played around with the data, and basically I came up with what is a new graph type for her. It's not a new graph type I didn't invent it. It existed. She just hadn't been exposed to it before, and it ended up showing this particular relationship that she wanted to show in this sort of great way, and it was really illustrative. And you could, even if you had never seen this graph type before, you really could see the point. And again, I'm not saying story. Like most people, I think most people in the field say you could get the story right away, and it's not a story; it's just a point.
Mm-hmm.
And she published that, and it got picked up by a number of different news outlets. And that's for the people I work with at Urban, our goal is often to, not always, but often to connect to policymakers who can use that work. And this was one of those cases where taking just a simple graph or series of graphs and converting it to something that was a little maybe non-standard, a little different, and ultimately better, really help people connect with and understand the content. So sometimes it's just reframing things, and that's one of those cases where it was just recasting it, redeveloping it in a different way really, I think, helped communicate the content.
Yeah, I think I see one on your website there where essentially a line graph is basically broken apart. You break apart the lines, and you see it was more intuitive, I guess I would say that, just even for someone who's looked at a lot of line graphs and a lot of data, it's like, oh, yeah, this one's more intuitive. I can see what this is illustrating a lot clearer.
Yeah, where you take that line chart, it has like 4 lines, and they're all on top of each other. And it looks like spaghetti, and you just give them each kind of their own little panel.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it can be just a little. Sometimes it's just the little things, right? Like a lot of the things that I try to teach people about data visualization specifically is, try to get rid of all the stuff that's not data. So like, let's see, what's a good example? Like tick marks on a column chart. Like you don't need tick marks on a column chart because there's white space between the bars. So like anything that's not representing data or helping the audience understand the data is stuff that you can probably get rid of. So all like the thick grid lines and data markers and data labels and tick marks, a lot of that stuff can be removed so that you can help people get right to the data so that they can better understand the content without having to try to wade through all this stuff. So the example that you just mentioned is one of those where you say, okay, so there's 4 lines, they're crisscrossing, it's kind of hard to see. What if I gave each line its own little panel, and I just kind of sorted the panels next to each other so I can still see the relative values, but now I get to, I can really focus on each line individually because it doesn't look like spaghetti anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, where do you go for that? Say so, because for someone like myself that's been using essentially Excel, are there other packages out there that help you do these different type of graphs?
Yeah, so there's lots of cool tools out there. I'm a big Excel user, so people who visit my site will notice that I focus a lot on Excel because still a lot of people use Excel. But there's lots of other great tools out there. So I won't run through all of them because there's millions of them. But I'd say like for example, there's sort of, let's just build a spectrum for a quick second. So on one side of the spectrum are tools like Excel, where they are kind of drop and drag, they're click, they're that sort of thing. So tools that fall into that side of the spectrum, that's things like Excel, things like Tableau, which is a drop and drag tool that allows you to create interactive visualizations. Power BI, which is a Microsoft tool that connects to Excel, again, allows you to create interactive visualizations. On the far other end of this spectrum are tools where you have to learn to code. You have to do programming. And those sorts of tools would be things like R, which is an open source tool, JavaScript, which is open source, and specifically there's a library called D3, and that is the primary library or package that people use in JavaScript to create interactive visualizations. So if you're ever on the New York Times or the Washington Post websites and you're clicking around and you're exploring some graphic or some data, more likely than not, they have used D3 to create that graph. And then there's a suite of tools that sort of lies in the middle where it's a little bit of drop and drag, maybe requires a little bit of coding. Sometimes it sits on top of JavaScript. So there's tools like, I'll just name a few, like Data Wrapper, High Charts, Click, Quadragram, a new one called Flourish. These are all tools, and I can send you links to these, Jason, so maybe post them for people if they're really interested. But these are all tools that are a combination. They're trying to essentially reduce the barrier of entry to get in, because you don't necessarily need to code. You can sort of build basic things, and then coding sort of lets you take it to the next step. So there's lots of great tools out there. It's an interesting space because there's more data, because computers are faster, because there's more interest in visualizing data. And as you pick, in some ways you pick your poison, right, where you're going to lie along this spectrum. The tools that allow you to that are coding tools, they're harder to get into, but they're more flexible. You can basically build anything you want if you know how to code. Tools like Excel, you can build lots of things, but you can't build everything. And you can extend the capabilities of the tool, doing certain hacks and things. But it is at its core sort of drop and drag, and it's there's like a finite number of options there.
Yeah, there is. All right, John, I want to make sure people can connect with you. What's the best way to do that?
Oh, yeah, that'd be great. So people can find me on my website. That's policyviz.com. And they can also find me on Twitter. I'm quite active on Twitter. And then it's J Schwabish is my handle. And if they do go to the website, the spot there's a section of the website that's dedicated to my book, Better Presentations on How to Do a Better Job of Presenting data-rich content. And that part of the website has a lot of the tools and resources we've talked about, and also has a bunch of downloadable PowerPoint files and Excel files and worksheets and all that sort of good stuff. So those are the two main places that people can get a hold of me. All
right, great. So I guess going into the future here, what's your vision, what's your view, and where would you like to see things go?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm excited about where data viz is going, primarily because I think the field has sort of gotten over these little fights about pie charts and are pie charts good or bad, and we've sort of moved on to like, how do we connect with readers and users, and how do we, I think, sort of fight this concept of fake news, and how do we get people to better understand data and better understand how to connect with the content. So all the way back to what we started with, I think storytelling is going to be a bigger and bigger thing. I think trying to combine quantitative data and qualitative data is what is going to help people connect with content, because when you can show a video of an interview with someone who's being affected by some policy, and then you can combine that with survey data that sort of broadens it, that gives you this bigger perspective, you get people to both connect with the content on sort of a personal level, and then they understand the bigger story. So I'm really excited about that real component about it, is as the field of data visualization, I think, hones in on a better definition of story, that we'll start doing a better job of it. And then, of course, there's a technology side, and I'm not really sure where augmented and virtual reality will fall in this, but it's kind of neat to see. But I think my biggest the biggest thing I'm excited about is the field, I think, has moved on from these little, what might be considered, it's not little at the time. It's an evolution of the field, really, where we've moved on from these little debates, and now we're moving on to bigger questions about content, data quality, connecting with users, and storytelling more generally.
All right. Well, I'm excited for that myself, and moving into this and seeing where we go with this data. I guess I have one question. I guess is how do we prepare ourselves for that though? You said becoming more literate in some of these things. Is there something specific? I guess a normal person. I guess some of us who spend a lot of time in data. This seems more normal, but some people out there say, "What are these guys talking about? All this data." I understand different kind of graphs out there. What do I do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So how does a person better understand graphs? I think so. Aside from saying, well, go read a bunch of books and take a bunch of classes, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing that people can do is if they see a graph that they don't immediately recognize, to read it, to look at it. If it's something you don't recognize. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It doesn't mean that it's not presenting data in an objective, responsible way. It just may be different. It's not something that you've seen before. But just like anything else, once you read this new graph and you understand how it works, and I'd say the big news organizations do a really good job of trying to teach people how to read these graphs. Once you understand it, it becomes just like reading a line chart. I'll give you an example. So Jason, I'll put you on the spot real quick. So when do you think the New York Times published the first scatterplot?
First scatterplot?
I'll tell you that no one's ever gotten this right, so don't feel bad. So yeah, the first scatterplot.
I'll say. See, I don't even know how long the New York Times has been around. I'll say 50s.
Okay, the 50s. So from a friend of mine at the New York Times. So this isn't 100% factual, but what I've been told from my friend at the Times, that the first scatterplot in the New York Times was published in June of 2001.
Whoa.
So yeah, which is everybody's reaction to that. Like, that's not that long ago. And now if you go to the New York Times today and open any random page, you'll probably find a scatterplot. Like, they publish scatterplots all the time. And the reason being is I think they in particular have tried to educate their readers about how to use and read scatterplots. So it's become another chart type. It's for the New York Times, it's just like a line chart or a bar chart or a pie chart, because it's become part of the toolbox that they regularly publish. So I'd say if you're someone who is interested in data and graphs, and even if you're not, but if you want to expand the kinds of things that you see when you see a graph that you don't immediately recognize, even if it's content you're not interested in, just take a moment and try to read the graph and see if you can understand it, because then that becomes part of your arsenal. And from there, then you can start to say, okay, now I can read this graph. Now I can start thinking about, is this data right? That's sort of the next step. When you see a graph, take another second. Maybe the graph that you see is not representing the data. And I think where that becomes easiest is on outlets or people that obviously have a perspective, that have an agenda that they're trying to push.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, they are doing things with data or with the graphs that are not objective. They're not honest. And those things, once you start looking for them, become easier and easier to find.
All right, Jonathan, appreciate your time with us.
Yeah, Jason, thanks so much. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. And I'm hoping the best for you to keep moving this forward, because I'm excited to see where this goes.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it very much.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan, one more time for being here on StoryHinge. Thank you to each one of you out there. Just a few remarks before we close up today. And as always, I'll have Jonathan's links in the podcast and on the website. It's his company is called PolicyViz. That's PolicyViz.com if you want to check out that site. And like you said, you can find him on Twitter. It's at J Schwabish. That's SCHWABISH. And just a few thoughts. I really enjoyed this discussion with Jonathan and the importance of bringing story into data. As an engineer, I've don't know how many opportunities I've missed throughout my career and presenting data where I could have brought some story into that and made it more powerful. So maybe that's a lesson for all of us out there, that those of us who are using data and presenting that and trying to communicate with it, that there may be some opportunities. And even for those of you that don't, maybe it's the other way around, where you can bring some data in to help make your story more powerful. And I think really the combination of those two can be a more powerful message overall. And lastly is just the encouragement for each of you to take a little time to learn a little bit more about data and graphs and the different way that data is presented, so that you have some understanding of that. I think it's important as we keep moving into the future with more technology. And like we talked about, there's just so much more data that's going to be used out there because technology has the ability to gather so much more data. So we're going to see more of that, and I think it's important for us to understand it at a certain level. So I think I'll do it for this week, and we'll catch you back in 2 weeks. I invite you guys to share the podcast with others. It's moving forth, and and also to subscribe. I'll also put a plug in here for the other podcast I'm also doing with my brother as a co-host. It's called 73 Mentors, and it's a little different format. Here we're looking at story, trying to dive deeper into story and understand it, utilize it more in our lives, and as a communication tool so that we can be better communicators. 73 Mentors is more diving into the 73 most influential people who have ever lived and digging deeper into their lives, but still trying to extract some value and to apply it into our lives today. And we're just about wrapping up Plato, spending multiple hours talking about Plato and Plato's Republic. So if that's of an interest to you, check that out at 73 Mentors. You guys have a great week, and we will catch you in 2 weeks.
Thank you for sharing with us at StoryHinge. We hope this time together has added more goodness to your journey. Until next time, onward and upward, and may your own story continue to grow more beautiful.